Um, Certainly welcome questions. What I would ask is either hold the questions until the end or feel free to throw them in the chat along the way as they occur to you. I certainly want to allow time at the end to discuss any of this and answer any questions. And so we will certainly circle back to those questions or comments you may have at the end of the presentation. As Ann said, what we're going to focus on today is implementation science theories, models, and frameworks. I find that this is one of the more challenging and maybe sometimes mystifying parts of implementation science, particularly for those that are new to the field. Always good, I think, to try and demystify that a little bit for either new entrants to the field or even those that may have been working in this space for a while and just to kind of refresh things. So before getting into the substance of today's presentation, I want to first acknowledge the support that we receive for our hub from NIAD, as well as acknowledge the fantastic team that I work with in the hub. I think Renee and Robin and Anna have done such a phenomenal job of getting us all together and more importantly, kind of coordinating us and herding us along. So my objectives in today's talk, I think, are relatively modest. First, I want to define and distinguish implementation science theories, models, and frameworks. These terms are sometimes used interchangeably, but they are in fact different. So I would like to first establish some conceptual and definitional clarity. Second, I want to provide a high-level overview of commonly used IS frameworks and their purpose in implementation science studies. Third, to kind of help make the overview a little more tangible and relevant to all of you, I'm going to provide some examples or illustrations of how these frameworks can be used in different types of IS studies. And last, I'll conclude by offering some resources for those of you who may be interested in applying some of these approaches to your own research. So let's start by distinguishing between theories, models, and frameworks. So a framework can be thought of as a structure or a system of descriptive categories. And I think the key word here is descriptive. Frameworks do not provide explanations. What frameworks do is they help us organize all this sort of the chaos and all the many things out in our sort of social systems and organizational systems and put them into nice, neat categories. And that is really kind of the value of frameworks. A model, on the other hand, is a simplified version of some oftentimes more complex phenomenon. Unlike a theory, a model is descriptive. It's not explanatory, but in the case of a model, it does oftentimes tries to relate things like variables. We're oftentimes interested in understanding the relationships between things, and a model really helps us illustrate those relationships. And a good example of this in implementation science is the implementation research logic model that many people are now including in a lot of their grant proposals. And then finally, a theory can be formally defined as a set of principles or statements that describe a relationship between two or more variables. And the key thing to keep in mind with a theory is that it is useful for its ability to provide a potential explanation for how and why relationships exist. And consequently, theories are often used to help elucidate causal mechanisms, and they enable us to predict what will happen when we do something, when we actually intervene on something. Also worth noting that theories, while more comprehensive in terms of their explanatory power, they tend to be, at least in my opinion, less frequently invoked in research proposals. And I think that's in part because there's so much other material. We're trying to squeeze into those 12 pages or 6 pages for a career development award. So the ability to really get into depth when it comes to theory is somewhat, I think, compromised here. So theories tend to be more fully utilized in publications that result from our research projects, where we oftentimes have a little more space to kind of fully develop and utilize the theory. So next, I want to kind of work through an illustration to see if I can make some of these distinctions a little more concrete. And I'm going to start with what I think is a pretty well-known framework to many of you in the audience, and that is the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, also known as CFIR. Um, and as many of you know, CFIR consists of five major domains: the outer setting, inner setting, process, characteristics of individuals, and characteristics of innovation. So for this illustration, I'm going to focus on two of those domains, the outer setting and the inner setting. And as you know, with the CFIR, each of those five macro domains contains a number of constructs. So for example, the outer setting includes things like patient needs, peer pressure, or external policies and incentives. Likewise, the inner setting consists of things like the implementation climate, the overall organizational culture, or maybe the structure of their organization. Is it hierarchically organized, or are decisions more decentralized and pushed down to lower levels of the organization? As this figure is intended to illustrate, the CFIR really just organizes these different features or constructs into groups of things, into those domains. And in this case, the outer setting and the inner setting. And as a framework, the CFIR really doesn't try to make any kind of suggestions or inferences about how or why these different domains might be related to each other, or even the intervention's effectiveness. Again, it just helps us organize a lot of these things that we think matter into these different categories. However, if one were so inclined, you could try to relate these different domains, right? So, for example, we might believe that the outer setting doesn't directly affect implementation outcomes, but rather it works through or is mediated by the inner setting. So, for example, external incentives or changes in reimbursement may not directly affect an intervention's effectiveness, but they may alter the implementation climate in ways that may result in better adherence to an intervention and subsequently better outcomes. And note here, I think that as a model, it really suggests the relationship between these different things. But the reason why these things are related is still not clear. And for that, we really need a theory. So building on that same figure, a theory or maybe theories can help us understand why these things like the outer setting and inner setting and implementation outcomes are related. So, for example, we know from a lot of organizational research that organizations are dependent on and responsive to their external resource environments. We know that organizations oftentimes make decisions in somewhat predictable ways about what things to change internally and how to change them based on the resources in their external environment. So things like reimbursement, government regulations, competition with other organizations. All of these things are summarized in something called resource dependence theory, right? Likewise, let's say we want to know how the inner setting may affect these implementation outcomes. That is fundamentally a question of how and why. Well, one theory that can help us understand why the inner setting may affect implementation outcomes is the theory of organizational readiness for change. And according to this theory, readiness consists of two dimensions: capacity and motivation. Based on these two dimensions, we might argue that certain aspects of the inner setting, like a positive organizational culture, improves implementation outcomes because it increases employee motivations to implement the intervention with fidelity. So as you can hopefully see here, theories help us understand the causal mechanism between the different concepts that are delineated in a model. So in essence, theories really help us fill in the gaps or these arrows that you oftentimes see in models. So now hopefully you have a little better understanding of what theories, models, and frameworks are and how they differ. Next, I want to talk about the role they often play in implementation science studies. So I cannot take credit for this. This figure was adapted from a book chapter by Per Nilsson. Some of you may be familiar with it. As you can see in this figure, he has distinguished between 5 different categories of theories, models, and frameworks that are used for 3 different general purposes in implementation science studies. So first, here on the left-hand side, you have process models, which are generally used to describe or guide the process of translating research into practice. In the middle, you have determinant frameworks, um, classic theories and implementation theories, which are typically used to understand or explain what influences implementation outcomes. And then finally, on the right-hand side, you have evaluation frameworks, which, as the name suggests, are used to evaluate implementation efforts. So, as noted before, process models are typically used to describe the process of translating research into practice. And some of the commonly used process models in the implementation science literature include the knowledge to action model and quality improvement frameworks like PDSA cycles. Um, Process models also include stage-based models or frameworks like the exploration, preparation, implementation, and sustainment model, also known as EPIS, and the stages of implementation completion model. And the idea behind these models is that you can link certain steps together over time to illustrate how things progress as we're trying to implement and evaluate them. Here below, I've listed a sample aim that you might think of when using a process model. So, for example, you might have an aim that says to assess whether stakeholder perceptions of acceptability and feasibility of whatever your intervention is, or it could be an implementation strategy, whether and how that differs by stage of implementation. Again, just as an example. Determinant frameworks, as I said before, they identify factors, both facilitators and barriers, that influence things like implementation strategies and implementation outcomes. And some of the common determinant frameworks in the implementation science literature include the CFIR, which I mentioned before, the Promoting Action on Research, Implementation, and Health Services, also known as PARIS, and even the socio-ecological model. And I've denoted the ones here, the asterisk, the ones with asterisks. These are ones that have validated measurement instruments, which we'll come back to later when we talk about sort of the pragmatic qualities of some of these frameworks. I've also listed here some sample aims you might think of when using a determinant framework. So for example, often see an aim like to determine barriers and facilitators of using some intervention or implementation strategy from the perspective of different stakeholders, or more generically, to assess contextual factors of the intervention settings that influence utilization and dissemination of the intervention. So regardless of the specific language, as you can see, determinant frameworks and kind of the corresponding aims still kind of seek to identify and organize things. Classic theories are those theories that typically originate from fields outside of implementation science. In many ways, implementation science is kind of I'll say, sort of a derivative of or a combination of different scientific disciplines. So oftentimes these theories are brought in from other disciplines. Some of the classic theories you might see used include things like social cognitive theory or the theory of planned behavior. There are also a wide range of organizational theories and social network theories that are applicable in implementation science studies. Implementation theories are a lot like classic theories, except they have originated within the implementation science field and have been developed or maybe modified by implementation researchers. Some commonly used implementation theories that you may have encountered or likely will include Rogers' theory of innovation diffusion and normalization process theories. And then finally, we have evaluation frameworks, which are used to specify aspects of implementation to be evaluated to determine whether the implementation was successful or not. Some commonly used evaluation frameworks in the implementation science literature include the REAIM framework, Precede, Proceed, as well as the Proctor Implementation Outcomes Framework. So I think it's worth noting that these theories, models, and frameworks that we've been discussing, they can be mapped onto logic models, which again are increasingly being included and in some cases even expected in implementation science grant proposals. As many of you may know, a logic model is simply a description, often graphical, of the hypothesized kind of chain of events leading to an outcome of interest. In essence, logic models help us unpack the if-then relationships between the various elements leading to the outcomes of interest. And here I just illustrate one way you could think of how and where frameworks, theories, and models might be used in conjunction with your logic model. Or at least this is how I think of it. So for me, process models provide a good kind of overarching roadmap that links study aims. And this is especially true for complex studies with aims that span the implementation spectrum, from everything from identifying contextual determinants to assessing the impact of some intervention or implementation strategies on our outcomes of interest. And for similar reasons, I think process models provide a good scaffolding for early stage investigators when trying to describe how their preliminary work, perhaps a career development application, and subsequent work all fit together. Process models can really kind of help map that out and convey that to other people. Determinant frameworks are particularly helpful, shown up here on the left. These are particularly helpful for organizing the context in which interventions and implementation strategies are applied. For that reason, determinant frameworks are frequently, not always, but frequently used in the early stages of the logic model. So, for example, many people will use the CFER to understand what community or organizational factors are believed to support or hinder the use of an evidence-based intervention. This understanding can then be used to identify and develop implementation strategies to overcome those barriers. Evaluation frameworks over here on the upper right, these are really helpful in systematically thinking through the outcomes you may want to include in your study. And here I've used kind of an example from the Proctor Implementation Outcome Framework to, again, to kind of help systematically organize the different types of outcomes you may want to consider. And finally, classic theories or implementation theories shown here are especially useful for filling in the gaps and linking different parts of the logic model. So, for example, some logic models will specify causal mechanisms between the implementation strategies and the intervention of interest, and then eventually the outcomes. And classic theories and implementation theories, because they help us understand how and why these things are related, they're really ideally suited to unpack these causal mechanisms. So again, this is just one illustration of how these frameworks, theories, and models might fit with your logic, your own logic models. And it's by no means the only way. Another example, you could think about using process models in a more focused way within one of these steps of a logic model. But nevertheless, hopefully this gives you kind of a big picture ideas of how these different frameworks can kind of fit together as well as fit with your logic model if you're using those. Next, I want to go through a couple of examples to see if I can make those ideas even a little more concrete. The first example is a PCORI-funded implementation study that examined whether a set of standardized and customized implementation strategies could facilitate the implementation of a shared decision-making aid, and how the contextual circumstances of the 15 participating clinics influenced the use of those implementation strategies. In our case, we used a mixed methods observational case study design, due in part to the recognition that the contextual circumstances of each clinic will likely have important implications for the strategies that they adopted and the ability of those clinics to deploy those strategies given those different contextual differences. In this case, we used three different frameworks across different stages and aims of the study. So you see here, the first aim was a formative assessment of stakeholder needs and the contextual circumstances of the 15 clinics participating in the study. And in this case, for aim one, we used the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research and the Theory of Organizational Readiness to Implement Change, amongst others, to really kind of help us understand those contextual conditions that the clinics were working in. The second aim shown here was really kind of the heart of the study, and this is where the implementation strategies were put into action. And here we used Byron Powell's typology of implementation strategy, which in a sense you can think of as a determinate framework, as well as Proctor's implementation outcome framework to help us define our outcomes of interest. And then in the third aim, we focused on sustainability. In this case, we didn't have or really invoke a formal framework, but sustainability is, of course, encompassed by Proctor's implementation outcome framework. So here, this just kind of says the same things, but gives you more of a graphical illustration of what those aims look like and the frameworks that we used. As I mentioned, for our first aim, which was largely kind of a needs assessment and identification of implementation strategies, we used CFIR, the Theory of Organizational Readiness to Implement Change, as well as the literature on organizational learning and psychological safety. In the second aim, we relied on the CFIR and this typology of implementation strategies. And then over here, we continue to use, this should say actually Proctor's implementation outcome framework. The second example may resonate more with people working in the HIV space. Coastal is a type 2 hybrid effectiveness implementation study funded by NIAID that is examining how to adapt and integrate a multi-component intervention in a local health department in Mobile, Alabama. Secondly, we wanted to assess, or we are assessing its impact on clinical and implementation outcomes. And the third aim is we are going to be identifying appropriate and feasible implementation strategies that we plan to test in future work. So here are the aims that I just mentioned, overlaid onto, in this case, kind of an early version of our logic model. We are using, as you see at the top here, CIFER to kind of understand how contextual factors need to be considered when adapting our three-component intervention, which in this case includes data-driven community-based testing, referrals and linkage to care, and rapid ART. While we didn't specify this in our proposal, one question that you could ask is why these contextual factors may influence the need to adapt the intervention. In this case, for example, you could use something like resource dependence theory, which again comes out of the organizational literature. We are using REAIM to think about the outcomes to consider. In this case, the question to ask is why might the intervention components listed here produce these outcomes over here? What are those underlying mechanisms? In this case, we might consider something like attention theory, which also comes out of the organization and strategy literature. That might work particularly well for this community-based testing component of our intervention. And we might also consider something like normalization process theory for the linkage to care and rapid ART components of our intervention. Again, we didn't really specify these in the proposal, given kind of space constraints. So I'm really just theorizing kind of on the fly here, but hopefully this gives you an idea of what role these theories might play in this type of research. And then finally, although this is identified as future work, another question to be considered would be why these selected implementation strategies, which we are kind of identifying through this implementation mapping process, why would those strategies influence the uptake of our three-component intervention? And again, you might think of something like the theory of organizational readiness for change as a theory that might help us understand the relationship between the strategies and the intervention. So again, hopefully those examples give you a sense of how some of these theories, models, and frameworks fit together. One of the last things I want to discuss is the selection of theories, models, and frameworks. When I do consultations and meet with investigators, one of the most common questions I get is, what theory, model, or framework should I use? And like all good consultants, I say it depends, which is true, but it's also a very unsatisfying and unhelpful response, and I'm aware of that. So next, I'd like to take a few minutes to walk through some of the steps, criteria, and resources I use when trying to narrow the options, because there are many options when it comes to theories, models, and frameworks. So let's start with what I think is the first step, and that is clarifying your purpose. Before we pick any theory, model, or framework in implementation science, we really need to ask, what are we trying to accomplish in this study? What are we trying to accomplish right now? Because the quote unquote right framework depends entirely on the job you need it to do in your study. So first, are you planning an implementation? If your goal is to map out the steps, resources, partners, and timelines for rolling out an evidence-based intervention, then you're really kind of in this planning mode. And in that case, you might reach for a process framework like EPIS. Frameworks like EPIS help you think sequentially and systematically about what needs to happen before, during, and after you roll out the intervention. And these kinds of models or frameworks are especially helpful from a project management perspective, as well as for kind of structuring stakeholder engagement over time. Second, maybe your main goal is understanding determinants. Here you're trying to identify barriers and facilitators that could affect implementation. You want to know what in the inner setting, for example, or outer setting might help or hinder us. This is where determinant frameworks like CIFER, Paris, or PRISM come in. They give you a structured way to assess context so you can tailor your implementation strategies rather than taking a one size fits all, because we know that typically doesn't work. We need to recognize these kinds of contextual differences when we're thinking about implementation and the strategies we use to support implementation. Third, perhaps you're focused on guiding evaluation and you want to measure what's happening. Are people adopting the intervention? Is it reaching the intended population? Or is it being maintained over time? Evaluation frameworks like REAIM or Proctor's Implementation Outcomes Framework help you define and measure outcomes such as reach, adoption, and fidelity. These frameworks help us systematically think about outcomes and prevent us from getting tunnel vision. It's easy to kind of get tunnel vision when you're in the midst of putting all this together. These frameworks help us avoid that and also think beyond and think about the implementation outcomes that we know will eventually determine long-term impact. Fourth, maybe your interest is in explaining mechanisms. This is a somewhat underdeveloped area of implementation science, but there have been growing calls to try to elucidate these mechanisms. So if you're interested in that, you may be looking at classic theories like social cognitive theory or organizational learning theory to help understand and explain things like behavior change or learning processes or organizational dynamics. These kinds of theories help us generate hypotheses about the mechanisms as well as refine our strategies. Or I guess you may be thinking about scaling or sustaining your intervention. How do we spread this intervention across different sites and populations? How do we embed it into routine practice so it lasts beyond the grant period? Dissemination and sustainability frameworks like the diffusion of innovations theory or the dynamic sustainability framework are a couple of examples that help us think about spread, adaptation, and long-term integration. And I think the key takeaway from this slide is simple, but hopefully, I believe important, and that's that there isn't one best implementation framework. The right choice depends on your purpose. Once you're clear on that purpose, selecting the appropriate theory, model, or framework becomes much more straightforward or much more manageable, and hopefully much more strategic and is aligned with the goals of your proposed research. So once you're clear on the purpose, I think the next step is to identify your level of analysis. Implementation in healthcare, and really I think in most settings, doesn't happen in just one place. It happens across multiple levels, from individual clinicians all the way up to health systems and policy environments. And if we choose a framework that doesn't match the level where our problem actually lives, we risk missing key drivers of success or failure. So I like to ask when I'm thinking about appropriate theories, models, and frameworks is, at what level or levels is the implementation challenge really operating? And it can be multiple. At the individual level, we're oftentimes focused on things like provider knowledge, attitudes, and behavior change. Maybe clinicians aren't using an evidence intervention because they don't feel confident or they don't believe it's effective, or maybe they just simply forget while delivering care in the midst of all the other things that are happening. So if that's the main issue, you might draw on frameworks that focus on individual behavior, like the theoretical domains framework, which breaks down determinants of clinician behavior into multiple domains. Likewise, social cognitive theory can help us understand things about like self-efficacy and outcome expectations and learning through observation. But many implementation challenges don't stop at the individual level. They really reside at the team or organizational level. And here we're thinking about group dynamics, leadership, culture, workflow, resources. So, it may be the case that even if individual clinicians are motivated, they may not adopt a new practice if the clinic lacks staffing or it lacks the support of leaders. And this is where organizational and multi-level frameworks become really important. And then, of course, we have the system and policy level. And this includes things like reimbursement structures, regulatory environments, cross-organizational partnerships. Sometimes the biggest barriers to implementation really aren't inside the clinic at all. They are really more at that sort of policy or system level. Things like reporting requirements, payment models, policy constraints. So if we ignore that level, it's quite possible we design interventions and go about trying to implement those interventions that even though they're technically sound and we know they are effective, but they just can't be implemented and sustained given all these more macro level restrictions and constraints. So again, the key message here is be intentional about the level or levels that you're studying and intervening on, and really kind of understand, is this primarily a behavior change problem? Is it a workflow or culture problem? Is it a policy or system problem? Or is it sort of a combination of those problems? Matching your framework to the appropriate level of analysis will help ensure that you're measuring the right variables and selecting the right strategies to overcome these problems. Another important consideration when selecting a theory model or framework is its pragmatic fit and its alignment with your project's goals. Even the most elegant or theoretically rich framework won't be of much use to you if it doesn't fit your project's constraints and realities. There are several things to consider when thinking about fit and alignment, which I've kind of enumerated here. First, you should consider the time you have available and the resources you have available to do the research. Some frameworks are incredibly comprehensive. CFR is a good example. Very rich, very comprehensive. However, conducting interviews and analyzing data on the full range of CFR domains and constructs can require a lot of time, both planning and collecting and analyzing data. You need to be sure you have sufficient time to operationalize that. Other theories, models, and frameworks are much leaner and are actually designed, I think, or more well suited for rapid cycle work. So if you know that you need to use insights gained from this kind of preliminary work, again, you need to know whether the CFR, even though it is very comprehensive, whether you can actually deploy it in a way that allows you to get the work done. Another consideration is familiarity. Are your partners, stakeholders, or even research team members already familiar and comfortable with a particular framework? And I think that's familiar because, or important because familiarity kind of accelerates buy-in. It can improve data quality. The more familiar you are with a framework, the easier it is to sort of navigate it when collecting data. It can also reduce training needs, either within your team, within your research team, or with your implementing partners. Familiarity, as I mentioned, can also expedite data collection and analysis because those, when you're familiar with an instrument, it's easier to sort of adapt it and prepare it for use. So if you, your research team, and implementing partners have used a particular theory, model, or framework in the past, I think it can be a real advantage. Setting complexity is another important consideration. Some contexts, like large health systems or multi-level public health interventions, really require multi-level frameworks. Others work fine with simpler, more focused models, but I think we need to be honest about the settings in which we are studying these things and how complex they are, and select frameworks that can kind of reflect that complexity without overwhelming your team. Data collection is another pragmatic consideration. Each framework implicitly or explicitly requires certain types of data. And the question is, are you able to gather the data that that framework suggests you needs? For example, if a model relies heavily on measuring things like maintenance or long-term outcomes, do you have the means to track and capture those data? Also important to consider a framework's flexibility. Implementation rarely goes as planned. We all know this. We discover new barriers, priorities shift, even the context will change. And a flexible framework will allow you to adapt without derailing your study. And last, I think it's important to consider kind of the alignment with your project's goals. May seem obvious, but your framework should align with your study design, your outcomes of interest, the priorities of your stakeholder partners, and also your equity goals if you have them. So, for example, if you're conducting hybrid effectiveness implementation trials, your framework should support both clinical and implementation outcomes. Similarly, your framework should connect directly to what you plan to measure. So, for example, if your outcomes are behavioral, like provider prescribing behaviors, you need a framework that helps explain behavior change mechanisms. Incidentally, I think this is one place where I frequently see misalignment between the chosen framework and the measures included in a study. So, for example, I often see people invoke re-aim, where some outcomes simply aren't relevant given the stage of implementation. So, for example, if you are conducting a pilot feasibility study, there's a pretty good chance that you are not in a strong position to fully measure things like reach, maintenance, and maybe even effectiveness, at least not in a fully powered way. So the question is REAIM the right evaluation framework for that particular type of study? So next, I think a helpful resource to kind of complement these criteria is a website developed by researchers at UC San Diego, University of Colorado, Denver, and WashU. The website provides what I think is one of the most comprehensive databases cataloging different dissemination and implementation science theories, models, and frameworks. Importantly, it allows you to search using different criteria. You can kind of see down here on the left of this screenshot, including some of the ones that I've mentioned in my talk today. Things like level of analysis, study purpose, as well as specific study constructs that you may be interested in. As you can see here, you can also compare and contrast different theories, models, and frameworks using this tool. So it really gives you kind of a nice way to I think once you kind of define some of those broader parameters and narrow it down into a certain class of theory, model, and framework, this allows you to do more of a head-to-head comparison and ultimately make a decision about which theory, model, or framework makes the most sense for you. Also includes links out to other resources for some of these theories, models, and frameworks. So I encourage all of you who are trying to figure out what theory, model, or framework makes the most sense for you to visit this and bookmark this particular website. In addition to the website, there are other tools and resources that you may want to consider as you navigate the wide and sometimes bewildering array of theories, models, and frameworks. For example, some of the well-established and highly utilized frameworks like CIFR, REAIM, and EPIS, they have dedicated websites and communities of practice where you can find resources like data collection instruments and papers that you can reference. There are also educational offerings like TITRE and IRI, and a growing number of formal degree programs like the recently developed UAB graduate certificate in DNI science and healthcare. So those of you who are interested in getting more in-depth training, hopefully some of these resources will help scratch that itch. These are just some links to some of these resources. So for those of you who want the slides, hopefully this will give you a way to easily access some of the resources I've been talking about. So I want to wrap up this portion of the presentation with a few considerations and takeaways. First, I think it's important to try to think of theories, models, and frameworks as a guide for your research and not as a straitjacket. One of the primary value adds of theories, models, and frameworks is to help you think systematically about the things you need to consider in your research, whether it is determinants as inputs or factors bearing on your intervention or outcomes to be evaluated. I sometimes see people really kind of twisting themselves in knots trying to either fit a framework or model to their topic or vice versa. And you don't have to adhere dogmatically to the framework or theory that you think works for you. It may be that certain aspects of the framework or model are not pertinent to your study. So don't include it. You don't necessarily need to adopt these frameworks wholesale. I see this again a lot with REAIM and some of the other outcome or evaluation frameworks, but people think that if they're using it, they have to have a measure for each and every domain. And I don't think that's true, particularly when we think about the full spectrum of implementation research that we're oftentimes interested in. Use the framework to think through what is relevant, but don't force it. Second, I think it's important to know that no single theory, framework, or model is the best. Many of us have our own preferred or kind of pet frameworks, but all of them have strengths and weaknesses. Your choice of framework or theory should ultimately be driven first and foremost by the aims. If you're doing some open-ended exploration, then a determinate framework is likely appropriate. I already talked about, I like to use process models to help provide an overarching design. Another consideration when thinking about which framework works best for you is to consider what measurement instruments exist. I tend to prefer frameworks where pre-existing and preferably validated instruments exist. It just makes the research more efficient. And the last thing to take away from these remarks is that you have a lot of frameworks, theories, and models at your disposal, and you may need more than one, especially if the scope of the project is large. So I'm going to conclude by highlighting a couple of upcoming events that might be of interest. First, next month's seminar will feature Allison Varley providing an in-depth presentation on one of the frameworks I briefly mentioned today, the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research. Given the popularity of CIFR, this is always an informative and well-received seminar. So those of you who are interested in CIFR, please plan to join that seminar. Also want to mention that we will be hosting our next conversation hour on March 4th at 12 p.m. Central Time. And just as a reminder, these are virtual informal sessions where people can drop in with questions about their research. We don't come to these with a formal presentation. It really is intended to, hey, I had a question about whatever it is you're working on, and we kind of kick that around and see if we can't come up with some answers. So those are all the shameless plugs I have for some of our offerings. I'm going to stop there and open it up to any questions. I'll take a look at the chat and see what I may have missed and what other questions may exist.
Hi, this is Sarah. I just want to quickly say that anyone interested in joining our listserv to hear about all of our future webinars and future fun events, I just put it into the chat. So please sign up.
All right. Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, that's great. And I see most of the comments in the chat were about getting the slides, and Ann has kind of already responded to those. We'll make those available, and you're welcome to them, of course.
And one more shameless plug, if you would like to sign up for free consultation with Larry or any of the folks within our hub to talk about which frameworks might best fit for your work, please check out our website, and I added the consultation form.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, must be crystal clear. Thank you, Larry.
I don't believe that, Ann, but yeah, sure. People are just shy on this. What is it, a Wednesday afternoon?
Yeah. Oh, there's a question. Could you recommend a couple of overview articles or books?
Yes, I probably couldn't give you the citations off the top of my head, but I can probably incorporate them into the resource slide that before I share them with Ann and we can distribute them. There are a couple good overviews. The Per Nilsson one is a good one just to kind of map the terrain of different theories, models, and frameworks. And then there are a couple others. My particular interest is I trained as an organizational management scientist. There are a couple of good articles, for example, that talk about the ways to integrate organizational studies, organizational science with implementation science. So there are some of those as well. So some of it gets a little more specialized, but I will certainly see if I can come up with good ones, a few good ones that are more generalizable. Anna.
Hi, thanks. This was really great. Having attended a few of these, I thought today's was really special. So thank you, Larry. Um, I had a question about and I did join a little late, so apologies if this was covered, but like, when do you use a theory, when a model, when a framework? Like, sometimes I feel like, us and others kind of use them interchangeably, but I feel like there must be something unique and special about each of them that helps us think through the work a little better, but I'm not sure I'm aware of that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you my perspective on it, and others may differ or have other perspectives, but I briefly mentioned this in the remarks about theories, I think I'll start with frameworks. Frameworks are great for helping us understand different concepts that we want to examine, we want to measure in our studies. So I think a lot of times people will start with frameworks when they are putting together a grant proposal saying, oh, hey, we need to understand kind of contextual barriers, or we need to understand um, why or how this intervention is constructed. So those kinds of frameworks are good for helping us, again, sort of think about the different types of things we want to measure. So frameworks, I mean, it's pretty hard to imagine any kind of successful grant proposal these days, not including some framework or more often frameworks, um, given the scope of a project. Models, I think, are also typically used in grant proposals, whether they're called a model or not, but I think they help us stitch together those different frameworks, those different things we're going to measure. So I find it pretty easy to kind of combine those things and imagine how that would help support a grant proposal. Theories, in my opinion or experience, are less commonly used in grant proposals. They're things that we use when we're writing up the results of our paper, depending on where we're publishing it. Some journals may be more interested in theory-driven research. There's a small, but I don't know if it's loud or vocal, but there have been calls to do more research that elucidates kind of the causal mechanisms, and therefore there's a need for more theory and implementation science. I think that's happening in pockets, but I don't see a lot of progress there, even though there should be. So I do think they play different roles in the life cycle of a research project, as well as different roles of sort of the implementation process. Sort of pre-implementation work. Yes, frameworks definitely are needed as you move further along when you're actually implementing things and you're testing the implementation of an intervention. I think you need to start thinking more in terms of models as well as frameworks. So I think that's one way to kind of start to think about how they fit together and differ. Say other questions, but I know we're almost out of time, so I don't want to. Might have time for one more if somebody has a burning question. Not seeing anything. Do you see anything, Ann?
Nope,
Any
I think
questions?
that's it.
We
Thank
tired
you.
everyone out for the afternoon.
Lots to think about.
Mhm.
Well,
All
thank
right.
you everyone for joining and hope to see you next month at our next one on C4 2.0. Thanks, Larry.
All right. Thanks, everyone.